evidence for the resurrection. It seems to me that I'm a Christian for two reasons. One, I seem to have had a real genuine experience with God, with a changed life, and with the sense that I'm actually in a relationship with God, revealing things to me. I mean, there's a whole line of reasoning there, but that's not what I'm bringing today. The other reason why I'm a Christian, this really is important to me, is that there's a large amount of external evidence that keeps confirming the truth of Christianity. And I'm talking about philosophy, history, science, prophecy, etc. So while you can believe because of your experiences, there's also support through evidence, and that's what I'm planning to present today. So I'm going to give a two-part case for the resurrection of Christ, why I think it's reasonable to believe Jesus rose, based upon, like I said, two parts. The first part is facts of history. So these are like things that we can say very likely did happen in the first century. In fact, when I say facts, that's what I mean. I mean, these are things that very likely did happen in the first century. We're going to pool these things together and we'll have 12 facts that we can work with. And then the second part is to say, what's the best explanation of these facts? So like detectives will look at the facts and ask, what best explains these facts? And this will be our common ground, hopefully. So let me establish the common ground. That's the first chunk of what I'm doing. That's why I wanted so long, my intro is to establish a large number of facts. So first, let me say this. None of these facts that I'm giving you are miraculous. None of them are miraculous in nature. And they're all well evidenced. There's specific lines of evidence supporting each fact. And historians of all stripes, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Christian, they generally agree on these facts. There's majority agreement, at minimum, majority agreement, in some cases 99% agreement on these facts of history. So let's go through them. What I'll do right now is I'm going to share my screen, and I want to give you guys the visual of these facts. There we go. You should have it on your screens now. Here's the 12 facts. I know you can't read that, most of you, but I want you to have it as a screenshot. You could slow down and read them. I will summarize them in a much smaller fashion now, like this. Okay, so the first fact is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Bart Ehrman, the atheist, he says this is one of the most certain facts of history, that Jesus was crucified on the orders of Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. He offers 11 independent sources to support the death of Christ in this fashion. I could quote atheist after atheist that actually support this idea, who are historians and scholars in their fields. The second fact, if I can get my thing to scroll down, there we go. The second fact is that soon after the crucifixion, the disciples lost hope. They were discouraged, they were bereaved, they were despondent. They thought that everything was over. And there's no wonder, because they saw the death of Christ as proof that the Jewish leaders were right about Jesus, that this guy was obviously from the enemy and not from God. And the impact this would have would be the end of the movement, as it ended every messianic movement in the first century when the guy died. The third fact is that he was buried most likely in a private tomb. This is connected to the fourth fact, which is that Jesus' tomb was found empty soon after his interment. Now, of all the facts I'm going to share with you guys, these two, the entombment and the empty tomb, are the least supported by scholars. So I'm putting that out there, right? About 75% of scholars will agree with both of these. So there's still majority support, and it's across various worldviews. It's not just Christian or evangelical scholars. But I'm going to build a case for it. So let me give you 6 lines of evidence that support the empty tomb. The first one is this. It's multiply attested. We have it in multiple sources, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, as well as pre-Markan accounts, the pre-Markan source material for Mark, sermons and Acts. We have it in that content as well. We have it suggested in the writings of Paul. So we have multiple sources attesting to this, early sources as well. Number 2, it's enemy attested. We can get into more in this in the back and forth. I just want to get this on the table for discussion. It's enemy attested. In Matthew 28, we have the enemies of the Christians, of the early Christians. What they say about the death of Jesus is that his tomb is empty because it was robbed by the Christians. They stole the body. This continued on into the 2nd century. In Justin Martyr, we hear it. In Tertullian, we hear it. And in Celsus, the critic of Christians, he mocks Christians and says they stole the body. So when the enemy polemic accepts the empty tomb, I think we can say that it's very likely that it happened, which leads us to the third piece of evidence supporting it. There's no competing story. There's no story from the 1st century even suggesting something other than this happened. And we have multiple sources, including enemy attestation, that it did. Number 4, we have the testimony of women. This is more impressive to those who studied history more because it was embarrassing back then. The first people to proclaim the empty tomb were women, yet women were not good witnesses to Jewish or Roman people at the time. So it reads like real history. The women are part of the story because they couldn't get them out of this story. So embarrassing or not, they had to include them in the story of the empty tomb. Richard Bauckham's done really great work in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, on this as well, that helps support the eyewitness account of the women. Number 5, Joseph of Arimathea seems historical. Joseph of Arimathea is the guy who buried Jesus. He put him in the tomb. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, so he would be known to the people of the time. He's multiply attested in Mark, John, and Luke. He's local to the area. Arimathea was likely 4 to 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And so it would have been testable by the people in the area. And it was embarrassing that a Sanhedrin member actually helps Jesus when the disciples have fled. So when people admit embarrassing things, these things are more likely to be true when you're reading a historical account, or anybody's account for that matter. And finally, the 6th reason I'll give for the empty tomb is archaeology. We found 3 kinds of tombs from the time of Christ that have been discovered, and Jesus's tomb fits one of those kinds. In particular, it's the most expensive kind, which was known to be owned by, get this, people like members of the Sanhedrin. Think about this. We have archaeological verification that the empty tomb story is historical in nature. Jody Magnus, who actually works at the same college as Bart Ehrman, she's an expert on Jewish burial practices. She says, the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial accord well with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. So the conclusion is that it's supported by 6 different arguments, and I actually don't know of a good argument to refute the empty tomb. And people I talk to don't know one either, even scholars I've asked. They don't know of a single good argument or evidence-based argument, just ad hoc stuff, but nothing based on evidence like these are. G.H. Van Dalen concludes it's extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. You could look at the work of Bart Ehrman, for example, in that. So number 5, let's go to the next one, which is the appearances. The 5th fact I'll say is well evidenced from history is that the disciples had individual and group experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Christ. We have accounts of 2 people seeing Jesus, 7 people, 11, multiple times where the disciples as a group did, 500 at once, according to Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, he knows these people, and personally, he visited them, and he's relaying as what was known and said by them all along, that he appeared to Peter, and he appeared to James, and he appeared to the 12. So this is multiple attestation in different sources. In fact, these sources are in and outside the New Testament. We have other early accounts like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, that also say, yeah, there were these group appearances, whatever you want to say they were. If you want to call it, they were somehow delusional, but it happened in a group. They all seemed to be seeing it, and it convinced them that Jesus rose. Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist and a lead critic of the resurrection, he says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Mike Licona says this conclusion about the appearances is granted by a nearly unanimous consensus of modern scholars and may therefore be added to our historical bedrock. See, this is important because when we talk about possible explanations for these facts, we can rule out hallucinations, because by nature of the fact that hallucinations don't happen in groups like this, and we can actually I can quote sources in our discussion back and forth, hallucinations just don't happen in groups in this fashion. So this would be difficult to overcome. Let's add another one. Due to the experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. These appearances, they transformed their lives, even being willing to die for the belief that they had seen the risen Christ and he'd physically risen from the dead. Again, this is actually not controversial. Persecution in the early church is attested to by multiple sources, Christian and non-Christian, and we have especially strong historical support for Peter, James, and Paul. Yeah, for some of the apostles, we're not sure how they may have died, but we have strong support they were generally persecuted, and specifically Peter, James, and Paul died of martyrdom. Why is this important? Because being eyewitnesses means they're in a position to know if they had really seen those things. Seeing it in group settings. Hey, Mike. Yeah?
Real quick, sorry to interrupt. It looks like we've stopped at empty tomb. That's the last thing that we see on the slides.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm not sure why that is. I did test this ahead of time, I promise. Well, there you go.
There you go. There you go.
Don't ask me why that happened. I'm just going to put them all on the screen here, and then I'll that way I don't have to worry about that happening. Okay, so what did I end off here? Sorry about that. Okay, their lives were transformed, and their persecution seems to indicate that they were just being sincere, right? When they were willing to suffer, it means that they were telling the truth. Paula Fredrickson, who's not a Christian, she asserts that the disciples' conviction that they'd seen the risen Christ is part of historical bedrock, facts known past doubting. They really weren't lying. They really believed that they'd seen the risen Christ. Now, facts 7 and 8 on your screen already are related to the apostolic proclamation of the resurrection that began very early when the church was in its infancy. So that's the word early there. And then number 8 is the word Jerusalem. The disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection, it took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. These two are actually, they're well evidenced, but they're uncontroversial. I'm not going to try to explain everything in the brief time I have. I'm trying to make my opening as quick as possible so we can get into the meat of our back and forth. But these two, early in Jerusalem, they help rule out the idea that this was later legendary development, or that it was simply a lie, when the stuff these guys were claiming was readily testable by locals living right there in Jerusalem. And then number 9, the gospel message centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the center of the gospel message. That's that word central on your screen. This is just to say, it hurts the legend theory. Remember the negative impact the crucifixion had on Jesus's followers? We actually have support on this from Tacitus, who says that when Jesus was crucified, it temporarily shut down the movement. And then it suddenly exploded shortly thereafter and spread throughout the known world. And this is from a non-Christian historian. We're getting this data. So this is what would happen. But you'd expect the movement to die, but it suddenly explodes. This hurts the legend theory because some think the church started the belief in the resurrection, but the evidence from history seems to indicate it's belief in the resurrection that started the church. It was the events around the death and resurrection happened before the church exploded. Maybe I can put it that way. And then number 10, Jesus's movement was characterized by religious significance. That's the word religious there, which might seem odd to see it on your screen right there. Jesus, though it's generally accepted, Jesus was a miracle worker. Jesus was an exorcist. And Jesus saw himself as, quote, God's eschatological agent. This is not controversial, right? This means Jesus thought he was fulfilling prophecy. That's what that means. He thought he was fulfilling prophecy. And when you look at Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, it looks like Jesus did fulfill prophecy. I mean, just read them on their face. I've read Isaiah 53 to people, and they thought I was reading from the New Testament. It's remarkable. And the specific points of these prophecies relate to the confirmed facts of history, the death of Christ. So what I'm saying here is, if you're going to say, okay, fine, Jesus rose, but don't tell me God did it, I'm going to tell you the religious context in which Jesus died and rose indicates that it was God who did it. And we can talk more about that in the discussion back and forth. Number 11 is James. Oh, and I don't have on your screen Paul, but I'll put him up there in a minute. James was the brother of Jesus, and he was a former skeptic who did not believe in Jesus when Jesus was walking the earth, which is embarrassingly admitted in multiple places in Mark as well as John. However, after the resurrection in Acts 1:14, he's with the apostles. He's there gathered together. He becomes a leader in the early church. He actually becomes an apostle. And in 1 Corinthians 15:7, Paul, who knew James and met with James, he declares that James saw an appearance of Christ and that this is part of the bedrock foundation of Christianity. Gary Habermas, an expert in the historical Jesus studies, especially around the resurrection, he says that the majority of critical scholars writing on the subject grant the conversion of James as a result of what he perceived was a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. Mike Lycona says there's a significant heterogeneity within this group that includes atheists, agnostics, cynics, revisionists, moderates, and conservatives. So this isn't such a controversial claim I'm making here. I'm just saying that yeah, it happened. All right, so I should have Paul on your screen there. I'm not sure why I can't get that, but I'll put Paul up here. Number 12, within a few years, Paul, also known as Saul, the church persecutor, he becomes a Christian due to an experience he believes was an appearance of the risen Christ. We have Paul's own testimony for this in the epistles, and he suffered greatly for these things. Now, these facts that are on your screen, none of them are miraculous. They're all well evidenced. They all have majority support across scholars of differing worldviews. This should give us a good, reasonable common ground for what happened in the first century.
You have 5 minutes, just let you know.
I think, okay, well, all right. I'm watching my timers.
Yeah. We'll go beyond that if we need to.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, what is the best explanation for all this evidence? Right? Like, let's just think as a detective. If you're going to try to explain all this stuff, what explains it? The resurrection is obviously a decent explanation for this evidence. The disciples were in a position to know the truth. They held to it under persecution. The key elements around the story are confirmed. The resurrection explains it. But then what about alternate explanations? How about conspiracy? Some people put up conspiracy as a possible explanation. I don't think that conspiracy works because it, as you can see on your screen here, it simply, or you will see, I keep having it lose my, I apologize for that. I did test this. I promise you. Okay, there we go. As you can see, conspiracy theory, well, it breaks the idea the disciples were sincere. It doesn't explain why they went from lost hope to preaching the gospel. It doesn't explain the Jerusalem factor or James or Paul being converted. It doesn't explain too many of these factors. Hallucination, it gets even worse. Hallucination doesn't really explain these either. In fact, Dr. Gary Sibsey, he says he surveyed the professional literature on hallucination for 20 years worth of research, and he couldn't find a single documented case of a group hallucination that might account for these things. Not only this, but hallucinations of lost, dead loved ones don't result generally in people thinking they've risen from the dead. It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so then we can get to other theories, like legend. Legend is actually growing in popularity online, but the problem is you're just denying all of the history unless you have a really nuanced version of legend. And this is where I say, you know what, let's have a different conversation about how history is done and about why we should, have these facts in the first place. But the legend thing seems to be the laziest and most irresponsible solution to the problem. But now here's where I hit a roadblock. Because there's a group of, there's group accounts. You add hallucination plus legend plus confused. I almost forgot to mention this one. This doesn't work because you're just adding the problems of hallucination to the problems of legend to the problems of confused. Each of these will be refuted by known facts, and that's why they don't work when you add them together. And this is why none of these things, conspiracy, legend, swoon theory, hallucination, or a combination of them, none of them have gathered any support scholarly speaking. They just don't get support. Scholars generally, when they hit this, they just don't comment on what these facts explain. They'll agree to them, but not tell you what they mean. They will not endorse any of these solutions because they just don't work. Some people will take different tactics where they'll just have ways of saying, who cares? The Gospels contradict. My case right now is not based on the idea that the Gospels don't contradict. This is just a red herring. It has nothing to do with my current case. We're examining the New Testament documents as separate documents written in the first century. We're asking, how do you explain these things? So I don't think the Gospels contradict, but it's not relevant to the discussion. Others will just say things like, and I've heard Matt share this several times, that he's not convinced. I'm just not convinced. And to this, I just say, my job isn't actually to make someone be convinced. It's to present a reasonable case. Your job is to get convinced by reasonable cases. So I'm not convinced that someone not being convinced is a reason for me to not be convinced. Ultimately, what it frequently comes down to is saying no evidence could ever convince me. And this is something Matt, at least in the past, maybe not today, but in the past, he said over and over again that he can't even think of potential evidence that could convince him. I could have video footage and DNA, and there could have been a laboratory, but it still wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be that he's going to believe in the God of the Bible, that he raised Jesus. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that, Matt. That's just what I've gathered from watching your previous discussions. There's other ways of saying evidence doesn't matter. Bart Ehrman does this when he says, historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, a miracle is the least probable occurrence. This is what we call circular reasoning. In other words, the evidence doesn't matter. I don't care how much evidence you have for the resurrection. You can't say it happened. This is circular reasoning. I think normal people should be able to see right through this and take it off the table and ignore it, like the silliness that it is. Another way of saying it is dead people don't rise from the dead. They just don't. Okay, this is, again, just reading my current beliefs into the past. I believe that this couldn't happen, didn't happen, and therefore I reject the resurrection of Christ. So there's another one. You can only offer, and this is a quote from Matt from previous debate I heard, you can't offer a supernatural explanation until you prove the supernatural is possible. But this is the proof. This evidence for the resurrection is the proof that something supernatural happened. So what we're doing is we're saying the evidence won't count until you have evidence to prove the thing. But does anyone else see this? This is circular reasoning. I'm ruling it out. I'm not looking at the evidence. So these are ways of avoiding the evidence. And that's all I've got for the screen share part of it. Let me, how do I stop screen sharing? Did I do it? Okay.
You're great. Yeah, you're good. You're back.
All right. I'm trying to be as quick as I can. I would love and hopefully for the rest of our discussion to be focused on either, taking these facts and explaining why we accept or reject them, or explaining what they mean when you add them together. They point to the resurrection of Christ. And I'm hoping that we can say that because there is a resurrection of Jesus size footprint in the first century. And you look at it and the more data you get, because this is not just the 3 facts or 4 facts, right? We've gotten a lot of data here. The more data you get, the more it looks like Jesus rose from the dead.
Oh, wow. That was, or not, because I don't want to call them facts, right? Because these are just like what Mike said, most of the story.
I'm
like
trying to go through the list. It's really easy.
Mike, can you put that back up on the screen?
Oh, I can. It's going to take me just a moment to do that because I closed it.
It's fine. So the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't in any way evidence for the resurrection. Yes, it's a required thing that he must have died before he was resurrected, but the fact that he died is irrelevant to whether or not he was actually resurrected.
But do you agree with that? Like, do you agree that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate?
I have no idea. To me, this is largely a storybook whose veracity cannot be verified. I don't have any way to investigate this. There are no contemporary accounts. Not even in the Bible, there aren't contemporary accounts. We don't see the sort of things that we would expect. We don't see, the Romans reporting on, it's not like we found a document that shows, hey, here's the date we crucified Yeshua ben Joseph. That just doesn't exist. We don't tend to hear about anybody else who saw zombies rise up and march on Jerusalem when the crucifixion occurred. We don't have any reportings of the sky growing dark or the temple veil splitting.
Those things have nothing to do with my case.
I'm talking about, yes. Okay, I will agree because I just said that the death of Jesus has nothing to do with the resurrection, apart from that it was necessary. But these are things that are part of the same story, the same telling, sometimes just a handful of verses apart. As a matter of fact, if we go with the ending of Mark 16 at 8, there's nothing other than the women don't tell anybody. So when I'm looking at the Bible, I have to consider its reliability. And so when it says, hey, when Jesus was crucified, the temple veil split, the sky went dark, and zombies rose up and marched on Jerusalem, if we don't have any independent accounts of those things, isn't that preposterous? Do you think zombies marched on Jerusalem?
And I think that is a really ridiculous way to put it. And zombies, hold on a second. Let's be mature here. This is what I see all the time when I encounter and engage with the atheist community. It is constant mockery. It's like painful for Christians. They ask me, how do you handle it, Mike? Because the constant mockery of Christian faith, let's just take it straight, Matt. There's no zombies in Scripture. It talks about several people who were raised saints coming into the city. This, however, has nothing to do with my case. There are the scholars who would reject, I don't reject it, but who would reject that account in Matthew. They still would accept the facts that I've given you today. Yeah. So you're shifting the burden of proof to where I'm supposed to prove.
I'm not. I was
Scripture to talk about a historical case for the resurrection.
I was asked.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank Reston Bible Church for hosting our debate tonight. The resurrection of Jesus offers answers to more of the big questions than any other event in history. Does God exist? If so, does he care about us? Is there life after death? Do miracles occur? How can we know the true religion? Questions like that. And we had our answers to these questions when a group of women showed up at the tomb of Jesus and were greeted by an angel who said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen, just as he said." The early Christians defended this proclamation against critics, and it's an honor to carry on that defense nearly 2,000 years later. I'd also like to thank my friend John for representing the atheist position. This is my third debate with John, and his dedication continues to amaze me. I don't think Christians appreciate the sacrifice many of our atheist friends make when they spend so much of their time talking about Christianity. Anyone can understand why Christians want to discuss these issues. We believe they have eternal significance. But for atheists who are convinced that their existence ends in just a few decades, to spend those decades unwaveringly focused on Jesus and the Bible, we can only marvel that they're so generous with the little bit of time they've got. If I didn't know better, which I don't, I might think there's something spiritual going on here.
I hope you enjoyed that. I think that we can make a pretty good prediction at the upcoming debate between David Wood and Matt Dillahunty that's going to take place on the Modern Day Debate channel next week, that Matt Dillahunty will not win. It's very likely, given the history of David Wood's debates and the history of Matt Dillahunty's debates, that David will come out on top. And I want to commend Mike Winger, Pastor Mike Winger, for doing such an excellent job on Capturing Christianity's channel. And I also want to remind everyone of one of the reasons why I came to Jesus. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Again, I hope you'll please like and subscribe, and do come again. Bye-bye.